Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to start right away because there is quite a lot of ground to cover. In today's session, I'm going to very quickly recapitulate what TEEB is about, what the whole space of valuations is about. I'm going to focus on some of the more dicey questions regarding valuations as to why should we value and is it ethical and in what context can it be done and with what sort of methodologies and with what level of appropriateness can those methodologies be applied and so on. But before that, I also want to give you an idea as to what the valuations and foundations of TEEB are about, the ecological and economic foundations, which is effectively the first 7 lectures. And I'll talk to you a little bit about each of these areas that will be covered for you by the visiting speakers. As you know, altogether in this course we have more than 12, maybe 13 even, visiting speakers. And out of those, 4 are actually dedicated to this opening session. And so these first 7 lectures are actually vital for you because without these, unless your background happens to be from there, you won't really understand the theory. I won't say much about TEEB. I think you've seen the background to this project before. And I will say this, that the reason for TEEB really boiled down to something like 4 big reasons. Well, I think the first one, of course, is that the economic invisibility of nature is a problem. There's that lovely quotation all the way back from Benjamin Franklin, which blames our inability to value things as the source of most of our problems. And if we look around us, certainly that is the case in ecosystems and in biodiversity. The rates of losses are largely, in my opinion, attributable in some form or the other to the human inability to recognize their value or to demonstrate their value to each other or to capture that value in our policies and our mechanisms and our businesses. The second problem, the second reason why I think TEEB is important and why it's necessary is because TEEB brings together a vast amount of knowledge from different areas. It's a combination of ecology and economics and policy analysis. It's a combination of business thinking. All of that has to be brought together, and these very interdisciplinary approaches tend to somehow get missed because to this day, Yale is probably an exception, but to this day, most learning institutes are organized in silos, and what you learn in one silo, you tend not to pick up from others. So we do have an issue here in terms of bringing multidisciplinary knowledge to the table and doing it in a way which responds to local and country level and regional policymakers and businesses. And thirdly, I think the business and the policymaker and the administrator themselves comprise, in fact, different end users. They are decision makers. All of them will affect the way biodiversity survives or the way that ecosystems manage. But at the end of the day, their perspectives are different. Their drivers are different. And for you to engage them in any meaningful way on the ground, you need to speak differently, think differently, know differently sometimes. And I think that's what TEEB does because it's written separately as 4 separate books for the policymaker, for the administrator, for the business person, and for, if you like, the citizen. And lastly, I think there is an issue here in terms of where we have successes on the ground. I don't think we are doing enough to broadcast them or teach about them. I certainly don't think that they are being tried enough in terms of their replicability, tested enough in terms of replicability, and I certainly don't find many of them being scaled enough in terms of being relevant at a national scale or relevant at a regional scale or even a biome scale for that matter. So I think these are the reasons that we need to focus on TEEB. Finally, there's a whole issue itself which will be dealt with quite substantially later in the course, which is the whole connection between poverty and biodiversity. And how many of you have read Environmentalism of the Poor? It's quite a landmark book. Yes, one. Just one. Well, it's probably something that will get onto our list, but it's a book that outlines and describes why incomes and livelihoods of the poor are so significantly impacted by nature. The reality is, as you saw from some of the analysis that is there in the green booklet, that ecosystem services as a proportion of the livelihoods of rural farming communities in India, in Indonesia, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of people here, or for that matter, forest gathering communities, are not just 5-10% of their household incomes. We're talking about 50 to 90% of their household incomes. That's why it is so important. The poor get a lot from nature. Any viable model of development needs to recognize that reality, the base upon which more actions should be built. And finally, if you think about the key reasons for ending this economic invisibility, I'd see them as 5 different reasons. Firstly, that the sheer size and scale of the losses to human welfare as a result of the loss of ecosystems and biodiversity are too significant to ignore anymore. We're talking about trillions of dollars of natural capital per year being wiped out as a result of business as usual, as a result of the pace of losses. These business as usual losses do exacerbate poverty, and the earlier point I made regarding the significance of ecosystem services as a component of rural livelihoods is an example of that. Thirdly, there are economic solutions. We do have examples of success. Of course, there are a few failures as well, but there are many examples of success which deserve a bit of light, a bit of communication, a bit of replication attempt, and certainly a lot of scaling. Fourthly, there is employment potential. I don't think any government has to think too hard to be able to build a set of roads or bridges or add to an infrastructural network as a quiet way of adding to employment or pulling themselves out of recession. We certainly see in $2.5 trillion worth of expenditures of various kinds, investment and others, a raid by the G20 just when the last recession hit. But when it comes to investing in ecological infrastructure as against physical infrastructure, suddenly governments balk at the idea. And they balk at the idea because essentially these are once again invisible assets. And it's very difficult for them to get the mandate, as it were, from the people to approve a scheme which employed millions, for instance, to rebuild forests or rebuild lakes or rebuild soil fertility, for the sake of argument. The attitude changes when you're looking at natural capital versus physical capital. It is psychological as much as it is anything else. And finally, we do have, on the same vein, to start reflecting natural capital in our economic compass. We have to reflect it in our system of national accounts. We have to reflect it in the way that business accounts are measured. And if we don't start measuring them and reflecting these in these accounts, then we can never going to manage natural capital in any sensible way. Now, as I said, there is a kind of feedback from policymaking to the underlying, because one of the issues that come up with the policymaking suite is the role and significance of valuation and of economic analysis. And it clearly emphasizes and re-emphasizes that these valuations and these economic analyses are basically inputs. They are inputs to decision making. They're not the decisions themselves. And secondly, they bring information to the table in order to prepare those inputs. So there are these two layers which are always there, the information and the decision-making toolkit that are provided. And finally, it is the policymaker that has to make those decisions. Let me begin an introduction to valuation by quoting you a question that was put to me at least 20 times in the last 3 years. And ironically, this question was also insisted upon to be the title of a speech that I was to give in Australia, in the Sydney Opera House. Well, I couldn't really argue because the NGO in question are very good friends, and they said, no, this is what it has to be. And they were paying for my trip, so in addition to that. So I said, fine. I mean, if you insist, what's the world worth? I will talk about that. So I said, all right, what's the world worth means what's the living fabric of this planet worth. So let's imagine a planet which doesn't have the living fabric. And no prizes for guessing which one this is. It's Mars. So no biosphere, no forms of life, no human beings, no interactions, no economy, value of economy, 0. Then I said, all right, well now let's imagine a planet on which there is a biosphere, one which is slightly more familiar. And yes, there's life forms and human beings and exchanges between those human beings in society and an economy, i.e. one economy. So you've basically the marginal value of having a biosphere is 1 economy minus 0 economy divided by the original, which is 0 economy. That's 1 divided by 0, that's infinity. Thanks very much. That's the answer. And I walked off the stage. I actually walked off the stage. And of course, this was Australia, so I love doing that because I love pulling the legs of Australians. But they clapped, they got the jokes, so anyway. And then I came back and then talked about, what this is really about. It's not about the value of the universe. And I think someone said that, I think it's Mendelssohn who said that it's not a question of Darth Vader pointing a gun at you and saying, I'm going to destroy this planet if you don't pay me X, and the X is whatever, $38 trillion. It's much more about recognizing things on the ground. But having said that, I must say that I have to address this issue of these big global numbers just simply because of the number of times they keep coming up. in policy decisions, conversation drifts towards, well, there was this study in Nature, and well, there was this, that, and then, what was it that, you people had a study and you said the losses were, how many trillion was it? Yes. And then suddenly there's a level of wakefulness as a result of the big number. It's almost like an incantation, like you sort of puja in India, there's a god called Ganesha, and we begin everything with Om Shri Ganeshaya Namah. So in that sense, almost every conversation begins with this incantation of the big. It's almost as if we are sort of beholden to what is big, and that's probably psychological as well. It's just the nature of our society to be impressed by whatever is big. So a big number of services or a big loss, I think, sort of gets people's juices going, and then you have a conversation and you move on from there. But the two studies that I refer to, which keep getting referred to, is Costanza's study in Nature. It's in 1997. This has been criticized, and I think there are reasons for that as well, because there were certain extrapolations applied which one would question. And also the whole issue of why would you need to know, and how could you imagine an answer which is the total value of ecosystem services? Well, I think what Bob Costanza was trying to do was to wake people up, because this issue was so invisible that he needed a kind of shock treatment for people to wake them up, and I think he achieved that quite successfully. But as an academic exercise, it has been criticized. And what that concluded was that, well, the total value, if that were possible, of all ecosystem services on Earth were actually in a range that is $18 to $61 trillion, at a time when the global economy was only, GDP-wise, was only $25 trillion. So it was clearly big. And the average was some 38 trillion, and out of that, the ocean biomes had two-thirds of 24 trillion of that value, and per annum, and 14 trillion for the land-based biomes. Now, once again, the ocean biomes were a question of multiplying large areas by small numbers. You get large numbers. This logic has actually been used by a more detailed sort of and thoughtful study, which still uses the Costanza numbers, but does so in the context of protected areas. So they're not arguing about globalities. They're saying that of the world's protected areas, the value generated by a model where we are going from where we are today, as in nothing of the oceans conserved and about 10% of the Earth's land conserved, to something more like 30% of oceans conserved and 15% of lands conserved. That change in policy, if it were policies, global policies, if it could be achieved, would drive a change in value of X, and that X is going to be the securing of ecosystem services of the order of $4.5 to $5 trillion. And securing means that, well, you will not lose them. In other words, you would lose about half these ecosystem services, some 54%, and you won't, and therefore that's the value of having that additional conservation. And to give you a sense of was the spending big or small, the 45 billion that Bamford calculated, well, at that time in 2002, the total protected areas were absorbing something like $6.5 billion of government spending globally. So actually 45 billion was a steep ask to increase it sevenfold. The key result of that global calculation, the big number there, if you like, was not the 5.5 trillion, because we'd seen that before, and wasn't even the 45 billion, but it was the ratio. The fact that by investing only this much, a little sliver, you could secure ecosystem services from the protected area networks, which were about 100 times bigger. And of course, a benefit cost ratio of 100 to 1 has got to be impressive. Now, of course, that again hinges upon, guess what? The Costanza study, because in his cost-benefit analysis at the end of that report, he actually uses the total values, but after having multiplied them with various factors to account for the sort of the reality of the ground. And I think if he were to have redone his calculations based on not taking the ocean biome assumptions, the sort of scaling up which is challenged, then the answer would have been more like 40 to 1. But the fact is, even at a 40 to 1 level, which is like deflating the ocean biome's values to almost nothing, you still have quite an aggressive multiple, and that's where the value lies, as in that it is possible to put in investment in natural capital, ecological infrastructure, and generate public goods and services, which not really generate, but rather secure public goods and services values, which are of the order of like 40 times as much as that. So again, big numbers. But my question to all of these big numbers is something else. Never mind whether the fact that they are addressing a hypothesis, a Darth Vader hypothesis or whatever, or never mind, even if they are right or wrong, but who is going to use them? There is no such thing as a president of Earth or a prime minister of Earth who calls his cabinet tomorrow morning and says, guys, we have this big problem the scientists have pointed out and we must do. It doesn't happen that way, right? Just see how long we've been negotiating the UNFCCC's climate agreement and how far have we got. global solutions are not easy, and there's only limited value in having data, information provided as toolkit in the way that policymaking TEEB talks about at a global level. But what does matter is if you provide it one level below at the country level, or even more, it matters if you provide it 2 levels below at the region level, or even more if you provide it at the community or local level. That's when things start happening, because then you know whose problem it is, you know who has to solve it, it's the people on the ground. And that's when you begin to see traction, policy traction, administrative traction, business traction. So this brings me to TEEB's perspective on valuation. And our perspective is not this. So TEEB is not a cost-benefit based sort of solution for stewardship of the entire Earth. That's clearly what it's not. We are not here into pricing bees and butterflies. And by the way, someone tried that once on me. So someone whom I have to be careful what I say, but someone senior in a large international NGO actually thought that's what TEEB was going to be about. So way back in 2008, Magenzia was dragged into some public park in Bonn with 2 cameramen, and questions being asked to me is, so what is the value of that butterfly, Mr. Sukhdev? And I'm saying, well, I have no idea, and neither will I work it out. Why? Why wouldn't you do that? Or for that matter, that rose bush. Well, I'm not interested. Why are you not interested? Because, and by this time, the questioner was getting alarmed because, I wasn't giving the right answers. So I said, well, explain, hang on, this park has 2 entrances, as you can see. We both walked in free. If you really want to find out the ecosystem services delivered from this park, do some kind of a willingness to pay calculation on that and put some tests in place. We might find out what the ecosystem services of this park are worth as part of city biodiversity. And the guy was just totally disappointed because I hadn't come out with the price of a bee or whatever it is, or the price of a butterfly or a rose bush. But thank God. The good news is that he never made that movie, although he did film me for like 1 hour asking these questions. So that is clearly not what TEEB is about, and neither was it ever intended to be. But TEEB's perspective on valuation is much more nuanced. It is about the various layers at which societies recognize value. Recognize value as in we know something's valuable. If it's one of the several thousand sacred groves in Himachal Pradesh in India, then societies know that they're valuable because they will die rather than let that be lost. Or if they know it's a particular destination or a particular location, then they are connected to it spiritually, and it's worth infinity to them anyway. It's worth their lives. You can also demonstrate value, and then you can also capture value, but these are sub-layers within that recognizing of value. And what we highlight through TEEB is that there are typically 5 types of strategies, and I call them strategies because that's the broadest, loosest term that I can use here. There are regional plans which respond to the value of nature, of ecosystem services. There are legislations which are enacted. After all, most of the protected area system here in the US, or for that matter in the UK and elsewhere, the early national parks, were founded based on some idea of patrimony, some idea that this is heritage value, it belongs to the community, and therefore it must be given its pride of place. They didn't come outside of that. And those same strategies can, of course, be translated into norms and regulations at one level and policies, and at a smaller level in terms of demonstrating value, there are economic mechanisms, certifications, protected area valuations, payments for ecosystem services. And these capturings of value are still not markets, strictly speaking, because there are not many buyers, many sellers. They're usually bilaterally negotiated. It's not as if there are many instances and price discovery happening on an ongoing basis. A typical marketplace would have that, would have depth, would have liquidity, would have transparency, and would have a degree of commoditization. But here we are not talking about that. We're talking about one community north of Beijing negotiating with another prefecture south in the city of Beijing for the value to be ascribed for using less fertilizers and pesticides in order to improve the quality of water supply into the city. That's hardly a marketplace, although they may apply market thinking. It's certainly an economic mechanism, but it's not a marketplace. There are lots of examples in TEEB, and this is where the database comes into use. This is in Sichuan, in Baoxing County in China, where they actually changed their land use planning. So this is at the recognizing value level, based on ecosystem services, high value, low value. This is the Philippines, where legislation was introduced as in the wake of the bleaching event in '98, and it delivered economic value. It was calculated after the event. This is the classic example of demonstrating value of a swamp, which was going to be dammed but wasn't eventually because it was found that its potential value as a cleaning mechanism for human sewage was higher than its alternative use. And this is the example that I've used earlier for a protected species being reintroduced, making use of organic farming as a way of reintroducing its habitat. And economically it works both at the farmer level because they get premiums on so-called white stalk rice, which has been reintroduced. It works at the prefecture level because they get an additional income, almost $10 million a year, thanks to tourism. And that amounts to something like 1.4% of their total revenues. And there are literally 110 odd cases here in the database. So I do encourage you. By the way, how many people have explored this already?
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
The premium for organic rice, was that price discovery through the government or was that in the market?
Yeah, that was a marketplace discovery, yeah. And there were actually two levels. There was an organic level and there was a friendly, eco-friendly. So the strict organic goes at 50% odd and the eco-friendly goes at about 20 odd % premium, yeah. And this is still very much small scale though. It's not, I wouldn't call this scalable. I'd certainly call it replicable, yeah. Sorry, how many of you have gone into this website? This is going to be pretty useful for you when it comes to local policy. Okay, not many. Look, I encourage you to do this because there's stuff here which you will find illustrative of pretty much everything that we talk about. So finally, a checklist for valuations, and I'll illustrate with a TEEB valuation. Firstly, it's about not totalities but the margin. What are the marginal costs? What are the marginal benefits? It's about being context specific. You need to know what was the purpose of valuation. Was it green accounting? Was it payment for ecosystem services? Was it one of these mega studies to make a point to legislators are not listening? What was the purpose? It has to be location specific to be meaningful. Even if it's a mega study, it has to be location specific because there's only this much that you can do in terms of extrapolations. And it has to be scenario based, as in you're comparing marginal values between what and what, between scenario 1 and scenario 2. So what is scenario 1, which is usually business as usual? Scenario 2 is some change in something. Usually it's change in policy. It could be a change in climate. It could be a change in other land use, for instance, but usually it's a policy-driven change. So the scenarios are usually policy scenarios. And finally, modeling has to be done with extreme care because the kind of glorious assumptions that sometimes can be made are really, really distressing. And modeling also means not just on the benefit side, but the cost side. Because one of the crazy things that we found is that even though, for instance, there were 20,000 restoration projects which were brought to our attention when we were trying to make the economic case for restoration as a form of adaptation, out of those, only about 90 had costs calculated properly, and out of those, only about 18 the cost calculations were good enough for us to use. So we had to speculate about the benefits, but we knew the actual costs of those restoration projects to be able to work out cost-benefit analyses. A more recent analysis has collected as many as 91 case studies. We're talking about 20,000 restoration projects and like 0.1 to 0.4% of the total number actually has decent cost calculations. It suggests that there is negligence in or a lack of appreciation of the importance of keeping this information by those who are actually doing these projects. Now I'll give you an example from a study which is not yet released, so please don't talk to the press about it as yet, which will come out, I think, sometime a month from now, which is basically a global analysis, but probably the last one that needs to be done, which I think has been done on the correct way, which is that it doesn't make vainglorious assumptions about benefits transfer. It doesn't assume that it can decide what the scenario is. In fact, there were 8 scenarios for which this study was done, and all of these 8 scenarios are on the basis of a survey that was done to actual policymakers in 55 countries. They were surveyed, and on the basis of their inputs, these 8 scenarios were chosen amongst the whole several dozen scenarios. And these scenarios are, one is to do with agri-productivity, another one to do with reducing post-harvest losses, another one about protected areas, etc. But these are actual scenarios. And the benefits transfer that was done, because of course several thousand studies were pulled together in order to get ecosystem service values from these small biome patches that were analyzed. But the number of biome patches was not 1 or 2, it was 2.5 million of them. 2.46 million biome patches on which the benefits transfer function was built. So this is the kind of detail that you need to get down to. Now, thankfully, we had the GIS model which backed this benefits transfer. It was the GIS model that gave this study the strength to do that benefits transfer with the levels of detail that makes it a meaningful study. Otherwise, it would just add to the ranks of the big global numbered kind of studies. Now, it's also set up, I think, in the right way, which is as a benefit cost analysis, because it calculates the costs, and amongst the costs are the opportunity costs of alternative land use. And in these scenarios, it does this cost benefit analysis, and you can see from here, from the column on the right-hand side, that there are two studies which are increasing agricultural productivity and reducing deforestation, and the latter is connected with implementing REDD+, which are the ones which really give you solid, positive cost benefits versus costs. And there are others, such as just bioenergy-based climate mitigation. Is anyone surprised by that number? The fact that bioenergy-based mitigation delivers only 1/10 of the benefits versus the costs? Anyone can suggest me an answer as to why this might be the case? Just imagine growing biofuels. Yeah, please.
The energy produced from growing them is not that much greater than the energy used
in growing them. Yeah, that is quite true. And the land use change. In addition to that energy equation, there's the land use equation, because very often if you do it in skies, you end up destroying rainforests and therefore releasing more carbon in the end of the day, which has an economic cost, Stern or whoever you want to use for that. So it's a combination of those factors. Yeah. So I think this kind of scenario analysis still makes sense if it is sensible to look at things from a global perspective. But I want to get on today to the second half of our conversation here, which is basically about the key themes of TEEB, and all of those themes take you down to the local level. They take you down to communities and where things matter. So there are 5 themes that I'd like to highlight here, which have been brought up in your reading in chapter 4. A lot of this is discussed in chapter 4. Some of this is my own perspective on it. So please do read chapter 4. Don't assume that if you've heard me, you don't need to read the chapter. That is not the case. Firstly, I think I and TEEB feel that the whole issue of valuation sometimes gets treated too lightly, as in something you can just roll up your sleeves and start doing. And the reality is that's not true. You really need to think about why are you valuing and what are the impacts, the implications long term to society and to the country concerned or to the community concerned of going along this valuation route. We've not valued nature for a long time. If we suddenly flip to doing it, the question is, what does that mean to the society? Secondly, it's important to recognize that it's a human institution. And who exercises this discipline, who conducts the valuation, actually makes a difference. Thirdly, the purpose has to be totally clear and transparent. Can't just produce numbers and then figure out afterwards what to do with them. Fourthly, there are uncertainties. We don't understand enough about ecosystem services. We don't understand ecosystem functioning in sufficient detail. We don't know enough about the dynamics. We can't predict climate change and its impacts on ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. And there are also risks involved in monetizing or going to a path which may lead to monetization. And finally, discounting, which is at the heart of pricing any capital asset. You're looking at benefits. You're speculating what those benefits are going to be in future. You're projecting into the future. That's one degree of uncertainty. And then you're also using a discount rate to say, what are those benefits in the future worth to us as a society today? So you're using what we call a social discount rate. And that involves an ethical choice. And then the question is, why did you make that ethical choice? Is it the right one? Is it the wrong one, etc.? So the questions that come to mind, that should come to mind is, everyone hears about interest rates. You don't that often hear about discount rates, except in corridors of learning. What's the difference? Is the discount rate an interest rate? Is an interest rate a discount rate? Well, the answer is it can be in certain circumstances. If you're discounting cash flows, there is something called an interest rate in each currency, which can be used for discounting a cash flow. But that's only if it's a certain cash flow. What if it's an uncertain cash flow? Well, then you have to add a credit premium. Then suddenly the interest rate that you apply is actually a credit-weighted interest rate, and that becomes somewhat different, and so on. Secondly, the question should come to your mind, does it matter what we are discounting? I mean, discounting cash flows, in other words, discounting the receipt in a bond or discounting the return of cash on a deposit, that's one thing. But what if I'm discounting goods, as in, what's the marginal value to me of my second car or my third television set? there's an issue to be asked here. And how does this value change over time? What would I swap today for tomorrow? For instance, I have 2 BlackBerries, right? I have a certain value on them. Yeah. Interestingly, you'll find that I place more value on this BlackBerry because it's slightly older and more used to using it than this one, which frustrates and confuses me every now and again. So firstly, that's not a perspective. That is a personal perspective. If I went to the shopkeeper and asked him, how do we value? He'd value it this way. So automatically, that valuation is different depending on who you are. How I value this in terms of this versus another BlackBerry into the future, a new one, would be different. So I'd apply a sort of declining discount rate here. I'd keep the value of this constant. This, to me, in a year's time, is probably worth even more because I got even more used to using it than I am now today. So I'm applying a different discount function for this one versus this one, swapping today versus the future. This is what happens when you're talking about goods. If this were not a BlackBerry, but a sandwich, right? What do you think the value of this sandwich is to me tomorrow? If it's this particular sandwich, it's worth nothing. It'll be stale, right? But if it's a sandwich swapped tomorrow for today, well, I'm hungry right now. I'm not going to be that hungry this time tomorrow, right? I'm not lecturing tomorrow. So clearly the value is less. So therefore, I apply a discount factor to the sandwich, which is quite steep. If you work it out, I mean, it's probably, I'll say, well, sandwich to me is worth $5 today. Tomorrow it's worth a lot less, the same sandwich delivered tomorrow. Sorry. And when we talk about social discount rates, then we have to look at factors, time value, if you like. What's the value of some service to society today versus the same service to society a year or 10 years or 50 years down the line? And you've also got to look at how production is changing. In other words, what's the increase in per capita production now versus the future versus the future? And these are the things that go into something which you learn about called the Ramsay's equation. The value of something in time, as in preference future versus now, and the actual quantities that are being produced, and the choice of society of getting more later versus automatically because of GDP growing. Per capita GDP is one of the elements which figures as part of the discount rate. Those who would have been familiar with the Stern Review would have remembered numbers like 0.1% as the time factor and 1.3% as the GDP growth per capita factor, leading to his conclusion of the use of a 1.4% discount rate. But these are discount rates. So the question also should come to you, this is a social discount, this is society's thinking. You should also ask the question, does this always have to be positive? I mean, can there be a minus 1.4? Well, it depends what you as a community are consuming. If you had no availability of produced goods and the only things that you were consuming were ecosystem services, food and water basically, and clothes perhaps, and if you knew for sure that your population in the community was going up and that the quantity of ecosystem services produced was going down, and guess what? That's not a surprising conclusion. That tends to happen. Then you might apply a negative discount rate. So it is possible to have communities and contexts in which discount rates are negative, as in things a year down the line are worth more to you as a society compared to what they are today. That is perfectly possible. So even these are possible, and please do ask Rich and see his different answers to these questions. And the final question should be, is there an ethical choice involved out here? Since we are deciding these numbers, are these just normative numbers? Are they just numbers that can simply be plucked from some spreadsheet and applied, or are we making an ethical choice? And here's how I would think about it. We had, way back in 2008, we had done something like a kind of literature survey of forest valuations, and we checked the discount rates that were used by the scientists and economists who had written them. And most of them, there were about 30 of these, most of them had discount rates between 3 and 5%. And on average, it was around 4%. So here's what 4% means. And it's basically a simple arithmetic calculation to see what 4% discounting means. So if you apply a 4% discount rate, what you're actually saying is that something that's worth today $1 million to us as a community or a society, if you apply a discount rate of 4% across 2 generations, that's 50 years, then the value of that comes out to 140,000. So if you are trading off something today, you're valuing something that's received by your grandchild in 50 years' time at $140,000, and you're saying the same thing, the same service to me is today worth, to me and my community today is worth $1 million of services, then you are making an ethical decision, which is that stuff to my grandchildren and to this society's grandchildren is worth approximately a seventh compared to what they're worth to us today. Now, is that a ethical choice or an unethical choice? And here's two alternative ways of looking at that. So if the society that is making this decision is you and me, like we are fairly well-to-do people, we can afford to look after our children, I would find it very difficult to justify this as an ethical choice to my two daughters, as in, well, you know, I've just traded off your children's future at 1/7 of what it is today. But if our society were a poor community, and we don't know where our next meal comes from, then it is important for us to be fed in order to maintain our children, never mind their children. So then we might apply the opposite logic, as in a high discount rate to the future, because what's coming to us today from nature is worth a lot more to our society compared to what may come to us, the same thing, in 50 years' time. So we would have a different ethical perspective on that. More important to feed me and my babies now, as against worry about their children in 50 years' time. These are ethical choices. They're complex societal ethical choices. And we have to recognize these when we undertake valuation and make use of discount rates. I want to leave you with a question which, something to mull over, which is an issue which does come up, because very often we find that those who are applying discount rates as part of their government calculations tend to use the same discount rate irrespective of the asset that is being compared. So an example that I use here is basically a dam, a hydroelectricity dam that is being built, and a discount rate is being applied based on government statistics and assumptions on the way the economy is being managed. And on the other side, there is a forest which is being submerged, which will of course lose ecosystem service values to society and to local communities. Now the question is it correct to use the same discount rate? And go back to this idea that there is a theory which suggests that you should look at not only your time preference for those services, not only whether those services are good for you today versus later, but how are they changing with time? Are those services increasing with time or decreasing? Are those services being consumed by more people in future or less people in future? And if the answer is that those services compared to electricity, which is being produced not just by my hydroelectric dam today, but also by 10 other forms of renewable energy, which I am planning for and are going to be produced in 20, 40 years' time or 10 years' time, if the increase in energy use per capita is a given, and if the amount of energy that is being produced to meet those consumption needs of energy is a given, then why should I not be applying a higher interest rate on the energy side of this trade-off choice versus a lower or a potentially negative interest rate, God forbid, to the natural flows side of this? It's not a trivial point. It's not a straightforward point to think that these two non-comparable assets should, of course, be treated with the same discount rate. And finally, some of this thinking that I'm describing to you today is actually not new. And I discovered it quite by chance in reading Tortola, which is an old journal article way back from 1967. These are his actual quotations from that article, so I just point these out to you that some of this potentially controversial thought is actually there in Tortola 1967. He's, in the first paragraph, what he's saying is that consumption-saving behavior is motivated by a desire to leave your heirs an estate as well as by the utility to be obtained by consumption. So he's talking about withheld consumption and the utility that provides. Pointing the finger to the next point, which is the asset, the fact that utility doesn't only come about through consumption, but about having assets and bequeathing them, leaving them to the next generation. That also is utility. That's value that you derive from non-use, and non-use values do exist. And then the final point is about the point that my last example was, which is asymmetry. That the quantitative significance of the asymmetry in the implications of technological advances for producing industrial goods on the one hand and natural environments on the other has got to be recognized. And he sees these as different asset classes. So some of this is actually there in literature, which is quite some time ago. And finally, these are the key messages that I think, as you discuss with Rich, I'll leave it for him to go through. But I'll go on to the next topic, which is from the chapter that was set as a reading for you today, which is about the ethics, the value articulating institutions, and the context of valuation as a human institution. Well, firstly, value articulating institutions. What is meant by institution? As this itself is a question. And thankfully, both Douglas North as well as Vatten, who's the scholar who's been quoted in TEEB, have comparable definitions here. Because Douglas talks about basically rules of the road as institutions, and within that group he includes constitutions, laws, taxation, insurance, market regulation, and other forms of informal societal behavior, customs, habits, and ideologies. So he sees those as human institutions. And likewise does Vatten, who's the one that the TEEB group has followed. And Vatten calls this constructed set of rules or typifications. And he goes on to talk about the bases for the kind of society you are and what that means in terms of the kind of valuation you will exercise. So if you are a society which is largely Cartesian, as in Judeo-Christian context and developed like we are here, you might argue and you might use the typical valuation techniques that we're all familiar with and which you will talk about: CVM, revealed preference, stated preference, etc. If you are more a community, which is a democratic community, which works with consultation and deliberation and sitting together in rooms and so on, well, you might follow that approach to valuation. You might follow a social process method, as it's called. And finally, if it's any kind of society, but hugely complex, and I will come to what kinds of complexities there are, then you might just have to follow multi-criteria methods, which is very often what tends to become the norm. Because, as I mentioned, the pure valuation exercise actually loses significance. When it gets into policy space, it just becomes one of the inputs towards the policy decision. I think fundamentally what we have to recognize, institutions matter. That the context of the institution matters, and the ecosystem service will vary depending on what kind of institution is doing the valuation. It's often been said, and I'll try and question this assumption later, but it's often been said that your background as a society, whether it's a Judeo-Christian developed society or whether it's a more community-minded, tribal type of society, makes a difference as to how you value. And there's an element of truth there. So what is being said is that seeing men as inheritors of earth, seeing men as if you like, owners of and custodians of ecosystems and custodians of the planet is an attitude, is a social attitude, is a cultural attitude that is imbibed within the Judeo-Christian tradition. And that leads to its own kinds of valuation. And some of the stuff that we are working on in the TEEB group and elsewhere tends to reflect that kind of society. Whereas there are other kinds of societies. There's worldviews which would suggest that man is not just Homo economicus. The man could well be Homo reciprocans in some situations. And that sort of view is also supported by thinking within the space of behavioral science and behavioral economics. That it's not only about taking a Cartesian approach. It's not only about taking very much a Judeo-Christian cultural backdrop to your thinking. Fundamentally, what is said is that approaches such as willingness to pay, approaches such as stated preference and revealed preference methods tend to work within the former context, whereas approaches such as deliberative methods and discussion methods and process methods tend to work more in the second kind of the more community-based societies. And this is the one thing which is there in the TEEB which I am most upset with, because they keep comparing, or they have compared amongst other people, quantum mechanics with valuation. And let me tell you, as an ex-physicist, there's nothing in comparison, but all that they're saying is actually the whole idea that in quantum mechanics you can't determine something to a point where you know its energy and you know its location, and know both of them exactly at the same time, because the measurement of physical quantities makes a difference to your knowledge of the physical quantities. And to some extent, what the comparison being drawn here is a little bit stretched, is that, well, in the same way, who you are, what institution you are, which people you are, which culture you're from, makes a difference as to what the value is. But anyway, it's a bit of a stretched point, in my opinion. Now I come on to the challenges. So as if those were not challenges enough, I've described to you the ethical challenges in discounting and some of the conceptual challenges there. I've described to you some of the context issues that are a problem, but there are more to come. Because the complexity of economic valuation takes on different layers, different dimensions. So there's an issue in terms of just the pure biophysical complexity. Every location is different. You can't compare one with the other. One mangrove versus another mangrove versus a third will behave differently depending on where they are, what kind of ecosystem background you're looking at, location, wind direction, etc., etc. What value communities derive in one place or the other will depend on what kind of fish species, what kind of impacts on climate, and their willingness to pay for whatever they get from the mangrove. So these things matter. The dynamics are not well understood. We still don't understand sufficiently the processes and the functions of ecosystems to be able to be totally confident when we are using valuations, but we do nevertheless, and that is something that we have to recognize. Many systems reach thresholds and they cease to deliver the functions in a linear kind of way. Even otherwise, they don't deliver linearly, but certainly close to thresholds, you test the resilience of a system, and you certainly don't have anything close to a linear approximation being valid. And finally, priorities of valuation depend for the same ecosystem in the same place and the same services, depending on who's asking and who's being asked. So you could end up with local communities feeling that the value of the mangroves for fisheries is the highest, or you could end up with visitors feeling that the value of the mangroves for sighting pink flamingos is highest. And the answers are different because the locals don't care a fig for sighting birds that they're totally familiar and bored with, but they do care for the fish that they eat, and so on. And finally, property rights. Sometimes the issues of how you value is enshrined in property rights, and sometimes these are recognized and at other times they're not recognized. And if decisions are made at a policy level and at a legislative level which displace property rights, then that creates its own level of problems, and it is a risk on valuation to not recognize that. In addition to the complexity, there's also the context, because the context could be a landscape context where it matters whether it's mixed use or not, whether it's proximate areas which are agricultural or not, a geological context as well as political context, because even politically, if you are two states adjacent to each other where forests in one are clearly providing resilience as well as freshwater regulation for the other, then it's a question as to who's valuing it. If you're valuing it, you might apply one logic. If the receiving state's valuing it, then it might apply another logic. And water gets involved because even if there aren't two states within the same country, and we have examples of where valuations are implicitly being done because people recognize, smart countries will recognize, that exported food grains are basically imported water shortage, and nobody really wants long-term water shortage. So that's a landscape context. Then there's a policy context, as in what are you trying to solve? When you put this valuation together and the purpose, what were you trying to address? Poverty, freshwater, soil fertility, combination of all of these. Institutional context, we've talked about that. Scale, this is something we've not discussed, but something like a coral reef has got local values in terms of fish nurseries. It has got regional and country values in terms of ecotourism and employment values. It's got global values in terms of carbon storage, and of course, global values of ecotourism. So there are different scales, and depending on at what scale you value, you may or may not end up with the same answers. And here's a little example which I'll give you from my own experience earlier, which will illustrate two of these purposes. In other words, how do you choose how to value? So firstly, you need to state the purpose, as I've said. You need to sort of recognize whose valuation it is, which segment of society, local, visitor, etc. You need to recognize that too much simplicity is wrong, because there is good literature which suggests that solutions should be about as complex as the problem that is being addressed. And then finally, you don't want to make it too complex, because otherwise it will just be difficult to implement, so it will not be effective. So these are aspects of valuation as well. And I'll illustrate from a personal example from India, which is with the Indian Supreme Court's response to our work on the Green Accounting Project for Indian states, what actually happened there. They were looking to justify a compensatory award, a set of compensatory payments for deforestation by official powers. So this is not private deforestation. This is deforestation by the likes of a coal mining company or by the likes of some official land acquisition for the purpose of infrastructure or habitation and so on. So even for that, there are internal transfers done. And it was being questioned because some private interests wanted that to be dropped in order that they could make a private acquisition case more cost effective. I got a call from the Centrally Empowered Committee of the Supreme Court. If you're an Indian in India, you don't want to be called by the court and by the police. That's bad news generally. So thankfully, the person calling turned out to be a gentleman who was only trying to do the right thing for his country, and all he wanted was numbers which were good enough to justify what he was trying to say. So the purpose in this particular policymaker's mind was absolutely crystal clear. He wanted numbers which were defensible and good and conservative, and still made the point that compensatory payments were not hot air and that they should be applied, and then there was a logic behind these so-called ecosystem services which were on the back of which were behind these compensatory payment numbers. And what actually happened is that he took our numbers from the Green Accounting Project, but he had to apply it within his context. So there was an institutional context which was in the Ministry of Environment and Forests, which was based on a classification of forests which had 16 ecotypes. This is based on the Champion and State. Those of you who are ecologists would be familiar with this. Champion and State had 16 ecotypes, and that classification in the mind of this policymaker was too complicated. So he was trying to reduce complexity by doing so. He was addressing and reducing complexity. So he invented, with the help of his colleagues, a subset of 6 classes of biomes. And those 6 classes corresponded also roughly with the classes that we in the Green Accounting Project in India had explored valuations of ecosystem services. And he then decided that he needed to reflect further policy context, because his policy objective was basically avoid deforestation, that you have to prevent dense forests from being deforested, and he wanted some degree of recognition of the higher value of ecosystem service from dense forests versus degraded and open forest. So he broke that further into 3 categories with the same average level. So this was being done by the policymakers. You can imagine the institution matters. The institution is basically something which is valuation enshrined in something known as the Centrally Empowered Committee of the Supreme Court, and rules and regulations which are being reframed by this official in the government. Now, I pointed out a problem with that. I said, look, we've done the Green Accounting Project as a green accounting project. Its purpose of valuation is not setting compensatory payments. Please, sir, please don't do this, because you will use the most conservative estimates that you possibly have. And he heard us out, and he even asked me to write a short note on why our valuations are conservative, which I did, only to find about 7 months later that they had been attached at the back of a Supreme Court judgment. That scared me, but that's the fact. But basically, he was aware of the fact that these were conservative, and he made the choice to impute a certain higher value on this logic, and agreeing with us that our valuations were conservative because they were made on the basis that whatever the assumption range for ecosystem services, we are doing this to adjust national accounts. We don't want to create a flutter. We want to point out that national accounting adjustments are possible, and that this is a conservative first offering to the government of India. So we knew that our range of assumption choices were conservative to a point that even by a factor of 10, by one entire order of magnitude of conservatism was being applied. So what he did was literally multiplied our numbers by 10 for so-called protected areas, once again reflecting a policy priority, which is that protected areas must be conserved more, and non-forest, non-protected areas are less. So there's a factor of 10 multiplying our numbers for protected areas, a factor of 5 multiplying our numbers for so-called sanctuaries. And that was this particular policymaker's response to, firstly, complexity and how do you respond to that. Secondly, purpose of valuation and how do you recognize that you want evaluation, but it seems to have been produced for the wrong purpose or different purpose. And thirdly, looking at some form of benefits transfer, because he was using, if you like, a different set of classification, and he was trying to address those classifications at the same time as address complexity. So this is how the institutional valuation actually works in places where it is applied. And yet it's not without its risks, because can someone point out the risk? This happened, by the way, you should have the clue, 2006. Do you think this has been updated since then? No, this is exactly the point. Those valuations were based on numbers which were valid then. Scarcities have increased. Inflation has increased. Surely there is an update required. And these are some of the risks that you have to think about in reality. So we'd probably have to write back to him, reminding him that it's overdue for an update. So here's a visual way of illustrating the general point about complexity, that you have complexity in terms of systems, simple and complex. You have complexity in terms of what's the decision-making point. Is it for the individual optimization or is it society's optimization? And you have complexity in terms of what kind of interaction. Is it the sort of more Cartesian instrumental type, or is it much more the community-based discussion, deliberation type? And these are planes actually. So this sort of gives you visually a sense of how decisions get more complex and cover a bigger plane as you move along these axes. But that's reality. That's what we have to do. Complexity does make a huge difference in the way that valuations can be conducted. And secondly, appropriateness. When is it inappropriate to value? And one of the ways of doing that is to look at complexity on the one hand and value plurality on the other. And it's easier to justify valuations which are in this box here, where you have more or less commodity-type values. They may most likely have some market reflection, and the simple system is operating where there are not too many values and there are not too many services. And on the other hand, where you have deep ethical convictions working and non-use values coming into play. And on the y-axis, as systems get more complex. So it's really the left-hand corner which is relatively easy to justify using valuation techniques. And as you get away from there and into that sort of visual space above the curve, so to speak, that's when things get more difficult. On the other hand, if you have the tails, sure, you have value plurality, but if the system is simple, you can probably still justify. And if it is a commodity, but there are different levels of complexity to that commodity, you can probably still justify the appropriateness of valuation. But in that big space out there, above, on the right-hand side, it does become a bit of a challenge. I want to quickly come on and close with the implications of economic valuation. It's not a costless exercise to do value. And when I say costless, it's not a costless, not just in terms of effort, but in terms of what you are doing to society. You are potentially changing the way that societies behave. You are viewing nature as something that can be brought within the economic plane. That's a vision, that's a view, that's an assumption. That's not something that automatically, that's not a sort of given, so to speak. It's got to be discussed, it's got to be ensured that it happens within the appropriate policy, institutional, and human contexts. And you are challenging questions of ownership, because the moment you bring in valuation means it is for someone's purpose, and the purpose has to be to, in some way or the other, preserve an asset for reward or actually pass an award at some point. And you can end up with going against the grain if you're talking about communities. And finally, there are long-term implications in terms of some of the underlying assumptions of classical and neoclassical economics. And it's been argued that economics does split up emotions underlying choices from the utility of the outcomes. And I think that logic, if it's followed to its conclusion, can make you feel that, yeah, you're not using utility appropriately as a concept in framing these valuations. And finally, there's this whole issue of nature and culture. Very often, the idea that I mentioned earlier, which is something worth thinking about, that a Judeo-Christian approach tends to lead to a Cartesian thinking, which tends to lead to the kind of TEV approach that we talk about, is actually one way of doing things. It's not the only way.